and welcome back to Book Banter. Hazel Gaynor is the award-winning New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction titles such as The Bird in the Bamboo Cage, The Girl Who Came Home, and my personal favorite, The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. In 2017, her first co-authored title with Heather Webb, Last Christmas in Paris, released to great fanfare, and their writing partnership continuing with titles like Meet Me in Monaco and 3 Words for Goodbye. Hazel lives in Ireland with her husband and 2 children. Please welcome Hazel to Book Banter.
Hello.
Hello and welcome.
Lovely to see you again.
So great to see you. It's always nice to chat about your books because I love them. You're a must-buy go-to author, and
you're very kind.
It's stunning. So,
thank you.
So excited to chat with you about it today. I first just want to give a quick shout out to Stacy, who is an avid fan, and she can't be with us live today, and she was so disappointed that work life was getting in the way of real life. And I think she has the coolest job, actually. She's a museum director at the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum.
Oh, wow.
I know, right?
Am I visiting?
So I think I can't wait. One day I'm going to go and meet her there because I think it's a fascinating job, and she's got the background insight and everything like that. So Stacy, I know you're going to watch the replay, so...
Hi, Stacey. I'm so touched by your enthusiasm for my writing, and what a wonderful, fascinating job you have. And I'm coming.
Right? We'll meet there.
Amazing.
It's so cool. Such a great thing. So congratulations on your latest release. The Last Lifeboat is a truly captivating story. I'm going to put this in front of the camera so everybody can see this beautiful cover. What a beautiful ocean blue. That's stunning. I wouldn't want to necessarily get in the water, but it's
yeah, it's a really beautiful cover, isn't it? It's really striking. Yeah,
it hits the mark. You know exactly what it's about, and yeah, I love it. It was the first thing that drew me in, although of course you're a must-buy author, so I will go and buy it anyway. But it is really a novel that will touch readers' hearts, so it's that good. So let's, you're welcome. Thank you for writing it, keeping us entertained. Let's start with how this story came to be. Now, it's based on historical fact. So I'm curious what sparked that idea, that initial, I have to write this.
Yeah, the nuggets.
Yes.
So, yeah, as you say, based on historical fact and based on a piece of the Second World War that I wasn't at all familiar with. And I think often I'm looking for those nuggets, those gems, those untold, uncovered bits of history within perhaps a very well-known event like the Second World War. And there's been an amazing amount of brilliant fiction written about that event and that era. So it was quite challenging to find something new, something different within that. And I was reading articles on the website of the Imperial War Museum, fascinating resource, which, it's the museum in London, but has an amazing sort of online resource where you can search for various things. And I was just really looking up. I started looking at evacuation. I was very aware of the first mass evacuation in Britain called Operation Pied Piper, where children were taken away from cities and towns to the safety of the countryside. Yeah. And that was a long planned program by the government and was put into action as soon as war was announced. What I hadn't heard about was a second wave of evacuation where children were taken overseas. So a point in the war in 1940 where it was firmly believed that Hitler was going to invade Britain. So suddenly these places that had once been considered safe, such as the coastal towns of Britain, were now the most dangerous. So the decision was taken to offer parents a chance to send their child away on these CVAC ships. So this word, CVACs, sea evacuees, was something I'd never heard of. And it was the story of one of these CVAC ships transporting evacuees to Canada, that was tragically torpedoed en route in the Atlantic. And that was the nugget. That was the point at which I knew there was this incredible story of human endurance, survival, the agony of choice that parents have been faced with to take the decision to send their child away so far away. And it's the story of this actual one lifeboat that was adrift in the Atlantic for a period of time. And that's the story I've reimagined through fictional characters in The Last Lifeboat. So really that one word, sea evacuee, I was like, what is that? Yeah. So just an amazing story that really had all the elements of drama, human endurance, and ultimately hope, which is what I found comes out of these harrowing stories time and time again. Yeah.
The resilience for humankind to find hope is continual.
It really is. And I think, in these darkest events of our past, and we've lived through a very, very traumatic global event recently ourselves with the pandemic, and it, time and again, didn't we see how people turned to humor, found incredible resourceful ways of doing things differently. And it was exactly the same in an event like the Second World War. And there were amazing accounts of humor, lightness, friendship, connection that I found in my research, reading about that event and the people that were on that ship. So it very much was fed into my imagining of how that was experienced.
And it's probably, having been through the pandemic and witnessed all of that we did, it becomes more poignant as you spot those things in history. They sort of resonate a little bit more deeply.
It does, because I think, we've tended to look back. I think we always look back historically through a little bit of rose-tinted spectacles, don't we? And we sort of have almost in some ways romanticized elements of an event like the Second World War. There was this keep calm and carry on, this sort of community spirit. And, you forget about the hardships and that unimaginable choice faced by a mother. Do you send your child away? Do you keep it with you, but face the risk of a bomb falling down on you, or, Hitler's army invading? And I think when you've been through something seismic that shifts everything you do, it disrupts life in such a shocking way, you can then relate to that a little bit more, can't you? That's the same way we weren't prepared for the pandemic. People weren't prepared for what they were asked to do in the Second World War. And that's what, as I say, I read an awful lot of those reactions from people who wrote about the war in diaries I read. So that was very, it does make it all make sense.
That was interesting. And it's not on our list of questions, but the diary entries was fascinating. And is that sort of how you navigated your journey through the research? Is by those accounts?
It was a surprising other nugget, really. So what I've found when researching not just the story of the sea evacuees, but trying to get a sense of what else was happening within the war in 1940, in this particular period of that 5-year event. And I came across another thing I hadn't known much about, was something called the Mass Observation Archive. And mass observation was, again, a British government decision to invite 500 people from across all walks of life in Britain to diarise their reaction to war. Isn't that amazing? So it was like sort of what we would now call a tweet or an Instagram post. People were really just short snippets of how they were responding to what was happening. And it was so brilliant because it was every human reaction. People were annoyed. People were mistrusting the government's decisions. People were funny. People saw humor where there was no right to be adding. And it really made me think about people who were living through that event quite differently. And again, related to how I saw people respond to COVID. So I took this idea of the mass observation diary entries and I created my own fictional versions of those. And I've kept them throughout the book, just really as a little breather for readers from the tension and drama, a little bit of another voice popping in. And there's a little bit of a mystery as to who is writing these diary entries. So
I love that part. I
yeah,
was like,
so
wait a
that's
minute, who is this?
yeah. So again, it was just an amazing piece of the history of the war, but had also really helped me think differently about how an ordinary person faced with what was happening may react on a day-to-day basis, and that there were obviously days where people reacted very differently to what we might have thought.
It's, it's actually very true because sometimes it's the mundane, every day-to-day things that are what weigh us down the most. I,
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. What are we going to have for dinner?
yeah.
You know,
Oh
you know,
gosh, it's hard
and of
enough
course,
when you have groceries in the cupboard.
and there's rations, and of course people were frustrated with rations. And what I found fascinating was that you do have this almost sense of the mundanity of war
Yeah.
on the one hand, and yet this catastrophic tragedy occurs which shifts everything for the people involved. And in the lifeboat, in my scenes where my characters are, there's a lot of the book written, and
Yeah.
the scenes are you're in the lifeboat with these survivors. And of course, the mundanity there is totally different. It's on a totally different scale, but the same problems. What are we going to do? How are we going to eat? That
Yes.
the same human functions have to take place.
Yes.
Yet, how does that happen in this situation? So it was that sort of contrast of how do we manage these very different experiences of the war, and the connection between my two female characters, Alice and Lily, who we
Yeah.
hear the story through. Yeah.
That's very true because it is, and it's hard to write one person's perspective from one location. It's really challenging because you're like, okay, well, what more can they do? Like, what more can they do in this boat, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And I was actually asked about this at an event last night. How do you keep adding something new to scenes where the whole premise of that is they're still in the lifeboat. They're still in the lifeboat is their home for this period of time, and
yes.
nothing changes. There's nothing different to look at. They can't walk into a different room. They can't get on a train. So that was really interesting to create the tension and drama in a scene that doesn't change. And I had never done that before.
Oh, you
Um,
did it well.
Thank you.
You did it really well.
It was actually, it was fascinating to sort of get into the head of that survival instinct, and how do people react, and how do you respond when thrown into that life or death situation with strangers, and what role do people take? Who's the helper? Who's the
That's right.
disruptor? Who is the mother? Who's the organizer? And of course, within the lifeboat, there were children. So I wanted to give the children some agency in that as well. And how did the
Oh, yeah.
children respond? And again, all based on an astonishing true story. So there was a lot of survivor accounts that I was able to draw on to learn more about what actually did happen. What were the things that drove people crazy in that situation? And I read lots of other survivor stories, from all sorts of experiences, and what is it that gets into someone's head in those situations. Yeah.
Because there'll be something that niggles, right? It's something that, like, for me, it would have been the cramped quarters of wanting to stretch those legs. Like, that would have been a real physical need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And for the children, I think the what children are like. They're
Yeah.
busy
And
and
they sit
active.
still for so many days.
You've got to stay in this small, cramped situation. For other people, it's those small little habits and quirks, and people become very hyper aware of somebody's breathing pattern, or
Yes.
somebody's singing, and how irritating, how irrationally irritating small things can become.
Totally.
And it's those that tip you over the edge beyond the bigger seismic situation that you're in. So yeah, it was really, and as I was writing, I was wondering, who would I have been? Which role would I take in that situation? And hopefully I'll never have to find out the answer.
Yes. Yes,
Um,
exactly.
Yeah. But I think
Exactly.
when we read or, hear about these events, I think that's often the thing that is compelling, isn't it? It's like, what would I do? Who would I have been?
Yes.
So that was
Well,
a really
it's
interesting
safe
question.
to read it from also from a historical perspective. So we're enough distance, and a book provides us enough space so we can feel it and try to understand and become more empathetic, but we don't have to live it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think my first book, The Girl Who Came Home, was set around the Titanic. And again, I think part of that fascination for me is, what decision would I have made? Would I have stepped into a lifeboat and left my husband? Would I have sacrificed my place for somebody who maybe had a child if I was younger? All those scenarios play out, which obviously in the real time, you don't have time to think, you just act. And that's very much what happened with this ship that was torpedoed, and this group who found themselves in a lifeboat that was missed in the rescue effort. So
That was stunning as well.
again,
That storyline.
and again, that's fact, that happened. And how did people back home hear about this event, and what must that have been like, where there was no solution, there was just people unaccounted for, just unimaginable. And in a period of time where there wasn't instant access to information, there was no rolling news feed 24 hours, there was nothing, which is why my character Lily was so fascinating to write, the mother back in London, and to see her emotional kind of turmoil and reaction to hearing that the ship her children were on had been torpedoed, and how does she respond to that?
And like any good mother, she solves the problem, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And again, Lily is entirely fictional. I mean, Lily, and again, when I discovered this story, one of the first questions that came to my mind was, well, who were the parents who took this decision to evacuate their child, and how did that play out for somebody who was just, a very ordinary working class woman, already dealing with the impact of war, and now dealing with this, and that refusal to give up hope, the maternal instinct to whatever you're being told, to refuse to believe that all hope is lost, and how people just step out of themselves, don't they, often in times of crisis, and find this inner strength that they didn't know they had.
Which is really, there's that hope, that string of hope is that parental bond, that you just don't leave anything on the table. You just keep going, right?
Yeah. And that, in the face of, part of Lily's story is in the face of very powerful government departments and men, that she still has her own story to tell. So that conflict and tension as well, between somebody who should just be quiet and be told what to do, and how is it, what is it like if you don't decide to play that way?
Absolutely. Because if you got to think too, in World War II, while everything's going on, it becomes normal that people are unaccounted for. So if that becomes the norm, then somebody asking to keep looking is out of the question, right?
Yeah,
it doesn't
happen. Yeah. And I think, again, looking back on an event like this, you look back on it really in isolation, but obviously at the time, this is one event happening in a myriad. There are other dramatic things happening in other countries, in other parts of the war, big campaigns in the North Africa, for example. There was so many component parts. So for people of Britain, I think this tragedy of a ship carrying some of their children was a national tragedy that people in Britain really took hold of and reacted very strongly to, at a time where maybe other parts of the war weren't being felt as closely to home.
Right.
So I think that was why this became such a shock to everybody, because suddenly this had happened almost on home soil.
Yeah.
And that was, one of the shifting sort of points of the war. And for Churchill, very much. And Churchill hadn't wanted this evacuation program to go ahead anyway.
Ah. Oh,
So
so to be proved right and still have to fix it.
absolutely,
Right?
and to face the fallout of
Yeah.
this. So politically, a sort of seismic event as well. So yeah, lots of, I think, as I say, looking back, we focus in on that one event. At the time, it was one of many things that were,
Oh, yeah.
requiring governments to assess. And this led to the program being suspended. So, it was a really big turning point in how the British government were dealing with the threat of invasion and the Blitz.
Yeah. Because how do you really evacuate everybody off of, out of a country? It's,
Yeah.
that's a
There
hard.
was 3,000 children were evacuated through the sea evacuee program prior to the torpedoing of the
Oh,
real ship.
wow.
So 3,000 children had already gone
Wow.
to host families in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Jamaica, and would spend the duration of the war there. So for those children, life changed in very different ways. They didn't come home. Some never came home.
I was wondering that if they came home, like if I got
Yeah.
shipped to, Australia, I may not come home either.
Yeah. And there's there are now groups who've formed as adults who were child evacuees, because they have that shared experience of, a sense of abandonment for many of them.
Yes.
Some had no home or parents to go home to for other reasons.
Right.
Maybe that didn't happen. So it's an incredible legacy that this evacuation program, and Britain was the only nation involved in the war to take any decision to evacuate its children. So it was very much alone in that as an agenda. And a very conflicted decision, and very difficult piece of British history, I think, for people to reconcile themselves with. It feels now unimaginable that you would send your child away.
It does.
But that was what was being very much pushed upon parents, and the propaganda was very much, if you don't do this, you're responsible for what happens if something happens to them in England. Yeah.
And I guess I imagine part of the politics about that might have been about feeding those people as well. So if you remove children from the equation, there's less mouths to feed. There's less strain on an already strained system. So there's
absolutely. That was very much part of the decision. Was resources were tight anyway. So if you remove a significant number of dependents, you don't have to stretch things as far. Plus, there was a sense of, I think, protecting some young ambassadors, as they were known as, these sort of brave young souls leaving Britain, who would then return to continue, the country. It was very, very sort of patriotic stuff happening, but ultimately was a failed program. So, and again, I'd never heard about this, and it seems such a huge event, such a massive decision, and such a big tragedy for people at Britain at a time when morale was essential. This was the Blitz. People needed to believe that we could get through this, and this happens in the middle of that event. It was really damaging to the government, but and as I said, was very quickly suspended.
It's interesting too. I think I've discovered just in the last probably 5-6 years that there's a lot of historical events that are really crucial to where we are now and why we are in the place we are that we were unaware of. And it's almost like everybody just kind of shushed themselves about it because, we don't speak of that. And, I think there's something to be said about historical fiction in shining a light on things, because when you know better, you make better decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, it's amazing. And I'm sure you hear this as well. I meet readers often who have only just encountered historical fiction and it's totally changed their perception on the word history. You know, the word history can make people think of boring lessons at school and dates and kings and queens if you're British, you know, and it's a misunderstanding of what history is and what history can teach us. And, you know, to put historical events in a novel form where ultimately the history is a backdrop, and why we keep turning the page is because we care about these characters that have been created in and around these dramatic events from our past. And I absolutely agree with you. I think we can, as novelists, we can find a way to make that forgotten history accessible and relatable, you know, to think about how maybe things aren't that different today. You know, we're still tragically seeing children fleeing home because of war, putting their lives at risk. You know, it's awful to think how relevant a lot of those historic events still are. But it's a fabulous way, I think, to engage in these lost pieces and lost voices, particularly children, because nobody asked them what they thought at the time.
No, they were meant to be seen, not heard.
Like seen and heard completely, as were women often, you know. These bits of history that have sort of got brushed aside, maybe because there was so much history happening at the time, so nobody had time to dwell on any one thing.
That could be it. Overwhelm.
Absolutely. Event overwhelm. And now we've got the time and the resources through the wonders of archives and museums and the internet. I don't know how anybody wrote anything before Google.
I know, right? It's a really good resource. Even that little walkie man around the earth.
It's amazing. Yeah, you know, you can travel without leaving your desk.
Yes, exactly. Although I do prefer the actual travel, but yes, in a pinch. Speaking of research, how long did you research before you dove into the writing aspect? Because there's a lot of very specific details.
Well, I kind of I have an overlap, really is the easiest way to describe it. So once I've found my story and I'm certain that it is a novel and that I can reimagine it on the page, then I really just start writing, because I of course, with a historical novel, as I said, the history has to form the framework, but really it's the story, it's the characters' lives on the page. So I start writing just quite freely. I don't plan my books, which is quite terrifying. No.
Wow.
No, I have a loose idea of maybe this, and very quickly I knew this was Alice in the lifeboat, Lily in London, two women who become connected by this tragedy but don't really know each other, and yet will be forever attached because of what's happened. That was the arc. I knew there were going to be children in there. And then I'm too excited to start writing. That energy of a new idea, I think, is precious, and you've got to really sort of throw that onto the page. And interestingly, early chapters I hand wrote of The Last Lifeboat are really, really very close to what's ended up in the finished book, which doesn't always happen, but it did this time.
I love that.
Rewarding. It's nice when it works.
Yes.
So I keep writing, and I'm researching and writing concurrently. You know, I don't sort of have a period of time where I'm purely researching. I find a piece in my story where I need to know detail, like how big was the lifeboat? How many people were in it?
I was going to ask that question. How big was the lifeboat?
What was the weather? But the lifeboat was, I can't remember the dimensions, but there were just shy of 40 people in it. But that is incredibly tightly packed. I mean, literally everyone tightly packed together, because obviously you're only meant to be in a lifeboat for maybe, I don't know, an hour until help arrives. You're not meant to be in this situation for very long, if at all. You know, lifeboats are really, you never want them to be used for the purpose they're designed for.
No, exactly.
And this, you know, therefore they're not really equipped in any way to sustain a number of people for a number of days, as happened. So yeah, just to understand what were the emergency supplies, how did they decide what rations of water to give to each other. Detail is really where I find research is crucial. The sort of reactions, how your characters, what have characters brought to that experience? Who are they before? What do they want? How are they going to change through this? Is very much imagination. So it's a kind of, sort of a dovetailing of research right, and that continues all the way through.
And that's a valid point. I mean, I'm always stopping to suddenly, there's going to be a toaster in the scene, and I need to know, was there actually toasters?
Absolutely, yeah.
And how did they work?
A day of research.
Oh my God.
To find out there weren't toasters, so I can't.
That is so true. Oh my gosh. Yep. We had a situation recently where in the second Hamilton book I'd planned around Thanksgiving, and only discover that it was the only year in Canadian history that Thanksgiving was not in October. They had it in July. And I was like, what? No. This has to be wrong. This source is wrong. I went down a complete rabbit hole going, wait, no.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. And there's so much, isn't there so much research that never gets into the book? And like you say, all those hours spent researching, how did people heat their homes? Did radiators exist? When was zips invented? How did she tie up her dress? Was it a zip? Was it I don't know, buttons? When did they come along? And it's these tiny nuggets that, that just, they're so important in a way, but there's such a, readers will just, hopefully, if we've done it well, readers won't even notice. Exactly. But it all is layering this world that we're asking readers to step into from their busy contemporary lives. But yeah, there's a lot of lost hours to curious things.
But we will kill the Trivial Pursuit history category.
Yes, we will.
If anybody would ever play with us again.
Yeah. Oh, pop quizzes. I mean, a phenomenal amount of useless information.
Exactly. It's the best part.
It really is.
Was there anything in particular in the research that just stuck out for you that was like, that was the wow, okay?
Well, I think, aside from discovering the story, and as I said, the mass observation diaries were just an amazingly helpful piece of World War II history that I hadn't known about. But I think really it was the detail of how things played out in the lifeboat, and just the sense of how such a small thing became such an enormous event in the timeline of life in the lifeboat. The drama of dealing out the rations of food and water, and how precious and how massive an event that became. And if something was dropped or spilt or lost, it was unimaginable, because this now meant their life likelihood of survival was now cut short by X amount of time. So that was really fascinating, I think, to discover how people had dealt with the situation. So more an emotional research, I suppose, than a factual research, a little bit of both. But yeah, there was amazing survivor accounts, as I said, that were incredibly helpful to understand that detail that I really needed to use in those scenes.
That's good that they have that base, because it certainly played a role in the end product, because it's been a long time since I've read an entire novel with a sob just stuck in my throat the whole way.
Yeah, I've been told it's an emotional read, and people have said, my goodness, it's a long time since I've finished a book and felt really bereft and sort of emotionally, which is amazing to hear, because that means I did my job well. But it's a nice reaction in a way that it's not it's a sort of a soft sadness, if that makes sense, that people are telling me there's this sort of hopeful sadness rather than just a miserable
Oh yeah.
not a miserable crying fest for the whole time, but it's just this tender sort of sorrow for that this ever happened, and what happens, obviously spoilers, but how each character's story plays out. So it's been amazing to hear this gut reaction to people that were created on a blank page. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, when you put those people in a lifeboat, and so the worst of case scenarios that we think is worst case scenarios happens fairly early. How do you keep amping up that tension and keeping us reading and turning pages when the worst has happened already? At least I think so.
Yeah. I mean, the worst really happens in the first chapter, in the first scene. We're right in there with Alice. We're in really, really big trouble here. And then we kind of fold back a little bit to learn, who is she? Why is she even in this? Why is she even on this ship? What happened? How did this become? And similarly with Lily getting to this point of deciding to do what she does. And I think from then on, it really was about creating characters that readers cared about. So, as we said, even though the setting of the lifeboat scene doesn't change per se, but it does, because each day becomes this life or death situation every single day. So every day you're almost resetting. It's like, okay, here we go again. What's going to happen today? And each day was different, and each day brought its own successes and failures within that little microcosm of life. And it's really about, it's about bringing a reader with you page after page after page, because they need to know, how is she going to get out? How are they going to get out of this? And similarly for Lily, how is she going to find out what's happened, and then what's she going to do? So it's the characters, isn't it, that brings you forward, that you want to keep reading about within the fluctuations of this unfolding drama.
Absolutely. And every single character has their own unique, real to life, individual personality and story, and they're so unique. Like, I could pick them out in my brain of which child is which one, and what their story is, and all the adults and how they got to be where they are. They're all fictional.
They are all fictional. Alice is very closely based on a real woman called Mary Cornish, who the government asked for adults to volunteer to escort groups of sea evacuees on these ships. And Alice is based on this woman, Mary, who volunteered. She was a music teacher in London, who stepped up and said, I can take my turn and help evacuate these children. And she ended up in the lifeboat that was lost, and was accounted with really taking most of the responsibility for keeping the children's spirits up, distracting them with games and stories, as Alice does. And so Alice was closely, I suppose, based on Mary's being the woman in the lifeboat, although Alice has an entirely fictional life and backstory. Okay. Everybody else is really fictional. The children were fictional, but I suppose sort of composites of the children who were evacuated, children of that era, and different classes, different backgrounds, different parental situations. And I wanted each child in the lifeboat to really have their own reason for being there. I didn't want them to just be sort of a backdrop. They all needed to have their own clear personalities, and they each add something to the events that unfold, and are very pivotal to the story as a whole, although Alice and Lily are the two main voices that we hear from.
I loved how you made them so unique. I love how they stood out and carried their own storyline, because that truly rounds out the experience from not just an adult's perspective, but the children's perspective that they go forward with. Like, they have to live their lives with that knowledge, with that experience, with some of them with loss, some of them, Like that was very poignant. It's yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was really, really important to me to, I suppose, give those children a voice, because as I said, we don't often ask, do we? Or we certainly didn't then. These events were dealt with. You just sort of got on with things afterwards. And particularly for children who have had to live with this their whole life. So I really did want to. And plus they were fascinating the characters to read about, and how they as adults remembered what had happened, and how they saw things in a really different way to how the adults in the lifeboat or how their parents saw this. I mean, to lots of the children, this was a fabulous, exciting adventure.
Yes.
To their parents, this was the worst situation that could ever have arisen. And immediately you've got that incredible child's point of view of life, which is very different to adults. So it was really interesting to add them.
I bet a nice place to visit too. The child's mind is a nice place to kind of visit and see the world through.
Absolutely, that innocence and the unwavering belief that of course we're going to be rescued. Of course the British Navy are coming to rescue us in their big warships. And isn't it
what
brilliant?
They do.
Just like I read. Yeah. So that lightness really that children had. And that was really important, because otherwise it could have become a bit relentless. So I think the children really helped to add a lightness to,
for sure,
and a different voice to the events in the life. But
did you have to keep them separate? Like, did you have a system for keeping them all? Because it's a big cast of characters in one lifeboat. Did you have to have like a system of, okay, this is so and so, and these are their attributes, or were you able to, once they were formed, they were so individual, like real people that were hanging out in your office as you wrote?
Yeah, they all just lived up here. I'm really not. I write very organically. I'm not one for spreadsheets or sort of big character plans of people in separate documents. It all really just comes out of here onto the page. And of course, every now and again, you have to sort of pull back a bit and think, okay, let's just put a few dates around this, because how old is that person if they were born then? And, all those complications come in.
Yeah.
But in terms of character, it's very much a transferal from imagination to page. I really feel I don't like having too many other documents, which I know is totally different to how a lot of writers work. They have details and breakdowns and time frames, and I'm like, nope. just want to get it down.
Get it. Yeah, and I would actually prefer that. I prefer to do what you do, is just write. But I tend to forget things very, very quickly.
Yeah, and that's why we have copy editors to say, well, in the scene he was 10 and now he's suddenly 14. So
yes, exactly. But in my head, so true. That's so true. And I have to say this because it's really, really important as a writer, and you are a master at this, when it comes to weaving a tale of destruction while maintaining enough hope to keep the reader hanging on for dear life. Is that obviously something that is just innate to you, or is it something that you actually strive for, that you specifically are looking at when you're rewriting or when you're going through the process? Is that?
Well, I think maybe some sense of it being innate in a way, because as I say, I don't forensically plan out, map out any of my books. I get a sense of what's at the heart of this story, and is it a sense of hope? What's the beat of this, So I think within the big arc of any novel, there's an underlying tone, I think, with any book that I read, whether it's light-hearted, whether it's like a warm hug, whether it is absolutely terrifying. I think there's some sort of personality is probably the best way to say it for each book. Yeah. And I think whether I've planned it or not, a lot of my books have a personality of hope. It's sort of enduring ability of humans to see the good in the bad, and obviously these dramatic settings are a fabulous jumping off point for that emotional journey. So it really comes through. Yeah, it just, I suppose, comes out partly of the situations that the book is set around, and partly it's just where my head goes.
That's good. That's a good place for your head to go.
Yeah,
Because
and
it's positive.
I like that. Yeah, the positivity and the, and actually it comes out so often when I read accounts of events from the past that, and I've said it a lot in interviews, it's almost impossible to write about tragedy without writing about hope. They're so closely enmeshed, and that when things are at their worst, people are at their best. It's just the way of the world. So I think that naturally comes through in the overall arc of a story set around, a dramatic event. Yeah,
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I love that. That's makes complete sense. And I think that's why the backdrop of the world wars is it's a built-in tragedy.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, it does, and I think I find it easier to write with that built-in tragedy. I find it more difficult to manufacture plots that are happening to a character um,
yes.
in normal everyday life. Yet, you go for a drive to the grocery store and there's a plot there. The plot is pushing against you as you try and get to the grocery store. So it's,
Yeah, absolutely.
it's all over the place.
Yeah,
But
and I think that's why there's been, such an amount of books that have been so successful set in events like the Second World War, because, as you say, you have this built-in premise of tragedy. We all know immediately when you say the Second World War, okay, I know what's going on. It's just, where does the story go within that?
Exactly.
And yeah, I think it's an interesting place to start, isn't it? Because then you've got that's already settled, and it's, where do you go with that as a novelist?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, as much as um, the market was inundated with World War II novels, I just don't believe that we're done with them yet, because for every individual who the war touched, there's a different story and a different perspective, and there's so much to learn from it.
There is, and that, again, so many books tell such a different account of that event, and it was a world war. There are so many locations, settings, situations, and people are still uncovering these forgotten histories within that event. And I think for as long as readers are keen to read them, and as a writer, I've never set out to say I'll always write in this era, or I'll always write about that event. So for me, it's the story, it's the thing that grabs me. I've written about the Second World War twice, so I'm not quite ready to go there again yet. I may come back to it in the future. You don't know. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And I don't think you can also only spend so much time in an era
Yes.
personally, because it does
Yeah.
steal
Yeah.
from you a bit as well, right? Like you need to have a lot of positivity behind you to to manage the research level of loss and hardship.
Yeah. That's it. It's a difficult period to be in, emotionally, and I think creatively, I'm always interested in sort of trying something new. And it's like, okay, well, what don't I know anything about? Let's learn about that and write about that. And that's what keeps me excited as a writer, and hopefully keeps my readers interested and excited to what's she going to do next.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. It's like, okay, what can I learn now?
Yeah,
It's my
yeah.
own little personal journey through history, and it's great. Uh, it's a good way to
Absolutely.
do it. I'm learning a lot about Cuba right now. So
Oh wow,
from
amazing.
it is, it's fascinating. Things I never knew.
Yeah.
So so I should ask, speaking of projects, can you tell us anything about your next project, or are you sworn to secrecy?
Well, kind of a bit of both. So I'm being unusually mysterious. So we haven't announced the next book, but it's being written, and I can say that it's going to be very different. But but is still historical in its tone. So moving into the end of the Great Depression, into the Dust Bowl era in the United States. However, within that historical backdrop, you are going to be surprised, I think, with the story I'm telling, which is a reimagining of a story that is very well known. And I'm taking a character and taking my imagination into that character's life. So I'm so excited, and I'm really being mysterious now.
Now we're like, okay, so when's the pre-order going up?
I just can't wait. I've told a very few close, trusted members of family, and the reaction every time has been, "Oh wow!" And I'm just so excited to. I'm just so excited for people to read the book.
That's a good sign. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah, so I'm just in early sort of first drafting, getting to the end of the first draft of that. And then the book I can tell you more about is Heather Webb and I, who write together. Our next co-written book is due next fall, and that's called Christmas with the Queen, and is inspired by the late Queen Elizabeth II and her famous Christmas Day message that became a tradition throughout her reign. And we're starting in 1952 with her first Christmas Day radio broadcast up to 1957, when she did her first ever televised Christmas broadcast. And we've created a fictional chef in the royal household and a fictional BBC royal reporter, and it's how their lives intertwine with the Queen's around this Christmas tradition.
Oh, that's going to be fun. It gave me goosebumps.
Lots of fun. I mean, we loved working together. We've dabbled in Christmas before. We've dabbled in royalty before. So we're I think we were always meant to bring them all together. So we're having great fun working on that together. Yeah.
Well, that'll be good. So it'll be this fall.
No, fall 24.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
A little bit of work to do yet. So.
There's that work part.
Oh, there's words to be written.
They don't just magically appear.
No, sadly not. Fairies do not appear in the middle of the night and finish your book.
Nope, they sure do not. They don't do the dishes either. So, you know.
The children, as it turns out.
Right? Yes. So, as we wrap up here, I am curious because I love hearing what authors are reading. So, can you tell us what you've recently read or what's on your bedside table that you would recommend to your best friend?
Yes. Well, and I'm so blessed with the job of writing comes access to everyone else's books, which is amazing. And we often get asked to read early copies of books that aren't out yet. So I've read so many things I never would have read other than getting access to things early. And one book that I know is on everybody's nightstand, I think, at the minute, that I read and adored is Yellowface by Rebecca Kwang, who wrote Babel and the Poppy Wars before that. It's just the most amazing, unputdownable. It's like a literary thriller that also manages to sort of pull back the curtain on the publishing industry and what it's like to be a writer. And she creates this amazing cast of characters and goes into the issues of cancel culture and toxic friendships. And, there's dastardly goings on. And it's just brilliant. I've never read anything like it. And I wouldn't normally go into a sort of thriller book at all. But it's just so fantastic. You'd laugh, you're sort of shocked. It's a brilliant book club book. You'd absolutely fly through it and get together and go, okay, now, what did you think about this? So highly recommend.
Oh, perfect. It's on my list because I did see it. I was like, oh, that looks really interesting. So So when you go to the bookstore this weekend, friends, you get Yellowface and you get The Last Lifeboat.
2 for 1.
Yes, exactly. That's what, I love a good recommendation. I mean, the TBR is, constantly growing.
I know. But disastrous leaning tower of books, but we get there eventually.
Exactly. That's my thought. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Hazel. It is always a pleasure to chat with you. And The Last Lifeboat is one historical fiction novel you will not want to miss, friends. So head over to your local bookshop, library, or online retailer and grab a copy today. Thanks for watching, everybody, and happy reading.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tanya.
Bye.